Hi lovelies, welcome back to the channel. Today we will going about the drafting of this beautiful monostrap gown you see right here on your screen. So it has three tiered layered puff sleeves. It also has a pocket in front. So a monostrap is basically a type of dress that has one shoulder and one part is off the shoulder, as you can see right here on the screen. So it is totally beginners friendly, and if it sounds like something interested in learning how to do, please continue watching and not also forget to subscribe to my channel. Without much ado, let's get started. There was once a day that I would pray. So I already went ahead to draft out a basic bodies behind the camera. So the first line I have is my shoulder line. So I marked 1 inch from top part of my paper to get my shoulder line. I have my chest line, my bust point, my under bust, and my half length. I divided my nipple to nipple point by 2 and I marked my darts. So having done all of this, I also went ahead to get the quarter of my bust circumference just right there on my chest line, and I also created my armhole. So now from the folded part of my paper, I'm going to get my neck width of 3 inches, and you can see I marked it right there on my shoulder line. So I extended that line to the top part of my paper. Then from that my shoulder line, I marked half of an inch up. Then I slanted it into the other part of my shoulder. So after this, I'm going to divide my waist circumference by 4. Whatever I have, I marked it on the line labeled HL, which is my half length. So I connected the quarter of my bust circumference on my chest line to my waistline. So on both sides on my dart leg, I went away by half of an inch. Then upward, I marked 5 inches. Then I'm going to connect all these dots this way. So right now I've created my dart. So this my dart now is 1 inch, which I'm going to replace because our dart is always replaced. It's not a stitching allowance or whatsoever. So you see the way I replaced my dart, and that is all for now because I'll be adding my stitching allowance while I'm cutting on my fabric. So I also went ahead to cut out my shoulder. So if you realize and notice something right here, I've not created my neck depth yet. So this is because this is a mono strap, and I'm just actually going to do this by the time I open up my pattern paper, which I already drafted on fold. So now I'm going to connect my shoulder line to this other part of my pattern paper, which is still neat. Now from that my shoulder line at that other side, I'm going to come down by 4.5 inches. So at this point, you can actually go deeper depending on how off the shoulder you want your dress to be, okay? But for me, I maintained 4.5 inches. Then on that my neck width, I marked towards the armhole part, I marked half of an inch away from my neck width, okay? So on the center of this my pattern paper, I'm going to come down by 2.5 inches. So these dots now I made at the end of the day, I'm going to connect all of them together. Starting from this half of an inch, I marked away from my neck width to this 2.5 inches, then all the way to this 4.5 inches. So you know this neckline is straight, it's not curved, not so curved, but it's kind of slant, okay? It's not curved at all. So this is what I have right now. So you can see that I'm going to move over to the back part of my dress. So it's basically the same thing almost, but the difference right here is that you have to include your zipper allowance, which I already marked right there, and I labeled my zipper allowance of 1 inch. So I'm also creating my darts right here, which is my nipple to nipple point divided by 2. So I also connected it this way. So the only difference with the creation of the dart for the front and back is that your dart for your back dress can actually go all the way up to your chest line, unlike that of the front part of our dress, okay? So I went ahead to replace my dart. This is just basically the same thing I did for the front part. I also maintained my neck width of 3 inches. I also gave this my shoulder slant. Then I'm adding my stitching allowance of 1.5 inches, which I've gone ahead now to connect. Then on the zipper allowance part, mark half of an inch away from your zipper line, go up by 5.5 inches, slant it this way and cut it out. So this is like basically the same thing almost with the front part. So I also drafted this particular one on fold as well. So I'm gonna head now to open up my pattern paper. I'll extend my shoulder line to the other part of my pattern paper. So I'll cut off my shoulder slant right here. So if you are creating your mono strap, ensure that the parts where you are cutting off from your shoulder for the front and back part is the same, like maintain the same part or point. So for me, I also went ahead to recreate everything I did for the front part. This is the same thing I did for the back part on this my neckline I'm creating right here, which is my mono strap. and I'm still maintaining the same side where I marked for the front part of my mono strap for the back part as well. I believe you see everything I'm doing right here. If my explanation is not so clear, okay, please pardon me. Notch your that as well, and also go ahead and cut out the zipper which you've already slanted, and now separate the two parts of your back dress. So this is what I have. When you separate it, yours should look like this as well. Now for the skirt part or the lower part of our gown, my full gown length is 37 inches. So I'm going to subtract 14 inches now, which is that my half length I drafted earlier. I marked my hip length of 8.5 inches. I got my full length of 37 inches, as you can see right there. So for some reason this stopped recording, but I'm going to quickly explain everything I did right here. So from my waistline, I actually came down by 5 inches, and I extended that line just this way, and I labeled it my dart line. Okay, so the next thing I did was to get my nipple to nipple points, and I marked it right there on my waistline. You can see, so I marked it right on my waistline and also on this my dart line. Then from my dart line, I went up by 5 inches, just as I've explained earlier. Then on both sides on this my dart line, I now came out by half of an inch and now connected my dart this way. So when I was done, I measured out my dart of 1 inch, and I went ahead to replace it at the sides of my skirt. Okay, and I now use my curve ruler to do it this way. So it's as simple as I've just explained it. There was nothing more added to it. Okay, so all this now I have, I'm going to just add my stitching allowance of 1.5 inches, which is the same stitching allowance I added for the upper part of my dress. Okay, so when you must have done this, I will now go ahead and cut this out. So remember, I've not added my hemming allowance, and from the top part of my paper, I marked half of an inch before I got my waistline, which will be for my joining allowance to the upper part of my gown. Okay, so I now folded my fabric into two because I want to use the same pattern paper to cut out for the back part of my skirt before I go ahead to cut it out for our front pocket. So I pinned this as well, starting from that 1 inch I marked, which is for my zipper allowance. So when I now pin this from the base or from the hem of my pattern paper, I marked 2 inches extra, which is going to be for my hemming allowance. So I now cut off the sides, I cut off the base and the top part as well. So for the zipper area, we are going to create our butt curve so that our butt doesn't look flat at the end of the day when we are done stitching and sewing our gown. So from that waist, I marked half of an inch away from my zipper. Then I came down by 5.5 inches. I marked it right there. So from that 5.5 inches, I'm going to mark 8 inches. So from now, that top part, I'll connect this from that half of an inch to that 5 inches. Then from that 5 inches, I'm going to connect to this 8 inches line, but I came out by half of an inch from that 8 inches line first. So everything I'm doing right here is just very clear. In case my explanation is not so clear to you all, you can see everything I'm doing right here very well. So go ahead now and cut out exactly the way you've marked on your fabric, as I'm doing right here. So when I'm done now for this, I'm going to just remove my pattern paper and notch down my zipper part, because most times it looks the same with the side of your skirt. So I'll remove this now so that I can go ahead to cut out for my pocket. Okay, so now that I have this piece of pattern paper for my skirt, so from the sides, I'm going to come in by 2 inches. From the sides, I'll come in by 2 inches. Then from the waist or the top part of my pattern paper, I came down by 7 inches. So I'm going to connect these 2 inches to these 7 inches at that very point right there. Then I'll go ahead and cut this out. So you all can see what I've done so far. This is what it looks like. So the next, I'll go ahead and place this now on my folded fabric. Remember, while you are cutting your fabric, ensure that it's always on fold. So from the base or the hem of my pattern paper, I'll also add these 2 inches, which will be for my hemming allowance. Okay, so I'll cut this out now the same. When I get to that pocket part where I marked and stop at 7 inches, I will notch and leave about half of an inch at that point for my joining. So the next I'll go ahead now is to cut the remaining part of my dress on my fabric. So this type of dress, if you're cutting it, you are not going to fold. I mean, for the upper part, you're not folding, so you're going to like spread it out just as I'm doing right here. So the right side of my fabric facing the camera, I place my pattern paper on top of it. So note that the right side of my pattern paper is facing the camera. Okay, so I added my stitching allowance of 1.5 inches to the sides, and on this neckline area I marked half of an inch, which will be for our joining allowance. Then for the two sides I added 1.5 inches for my stitching allowance. So that is all that is needed for this. I'll go ahead and cut this out. So please pay proper attention at this point so I don't make mistakes while cutting yours out. Okay, so because I'm cutting on the right side of my fabric, that is why I have the right side of my pattern paper facing the camera. Also, don't forget to notch that. Okay, I didn't add any allowance at the base because I already did that when I was drafting my basic bodies. All right, so still having my fabric spread out, I'm going to get this my front dress I've cut already, and I'm going to now turn it so that the right side can face the right side of my fabric. So this is going to make sure that it doesn't come out wrongly. Like you're not going to have the off shoulder part facing the normal shoulder part and the normal shoulder facing the off shoulder part. So this is because of I've experienced this. That's why I'm actually explaining this properly this way. So if you are pinning the right side of your fabric to your pattern paper, if you're cutting out for the back, please ensure that the part where you have your proper armhole is still the same part that has the same armhole with the front part. Or in order not to get you confused at all, as I've already cut out the front part of my upper dress, right side facing the camera, I mean my pattern paper, when I'm cutting out for the back part, I'm going to ensure that the wrong side of my pattern paper will not be facing the camera. Thereby, the right side of my pattern paper and the right side of my fabric will be facing each other. So I'll go ahead and fold my fabric into four because I want to cut out for our pocket, right? So fold into four so that I can have two sides of my pocket cut out at the same time. So for the width, I marked 8 inches, but I'll advise for the width, go as much as marking 11 inches, okay? So that by the time you fix your pocket, you can have enough allowance at the side so that you can join. Then for the length, you can go deep by 11 inches. It all depends on how deep you want your pocket to be. But for the width, please mark around 11 inches upward, okay? But it shouldn't be too much. All right, so I now place this my front skirt pattern at the very edge, very close to that my pocket. Then I'll cut the sides up to that 7 inches point, and I removed all of this. So the next thing now for me is to cut out my sleeve. So here is the basic sleeve pattern I drafted already. So because this is going to be a puff sleeve and I'll also be adding an elastic to that, I got the length of my sleeve of 19 inches and I added extra 6 inches to the length, because by the time you fix your sleeve, it's going to like stretch. Sorry, by the time you fix your elastic, it's going to stretch. So that was the reason for the extra allowance. Now from the folded end of my fabric, I'm going to mark 1 inch. So I'm going to mark 1 inch spaces and I'll connect this into a straight line. I'll mark 1 inch dot and I'll connect it into a straight line. So I'll continue doing this till I get to the very end of this my sleeve pattern. So all I have in total is 8 pieces of this. Then you now go ahead to start slashing. So you're going to slash or cut out everything entirely, just as I'm doing right here. So when I was done doing this, I have 8 pieces just like I said earlier. So I'm going to get my fabric and I'm also going to fold this into 4 so that I can have the both sleeve cut out at the same time. I don't want to go through the whole stress of cutting it out separately. So I'm just going to rule a straight line from the base of my fabric to be my guide, so that the base of each of these paper can be placed on that line as I pin. So I got my number 1 paper, I placed the base of it on that line, and I went ahead to pin the top part and also the base. So that is for number 1. So the spaces I want in between each of these patterns is 1 inch as well. So it all depends on how full and puff you want yours to be. So I didn't want mine to be too big or puffed. So that's why I'm just going about 1 inch all around. So the spaces I want in between, like I said, is 1 inch. So I'll pin number 1. I marked 1 inch space. I pin number 2. So from number 2, I measured 1 inch as well, and I pin number 3. Okay, as you can see. So from this number 3, I'm also going to measure out 1 inch. I'll mark it and also pin, and I continue till I go to the 8th or the last piece of paper I have right here. So I'm going to go ahead now to start cutting the armhole. You can see that it's now big and wide, and for the base I'm going to leave 1 inch for my hemming because of our elastic will be passing through, and I'll also cut the sides. So when I'm done, this is what it's going to look like, and you see how nice this is looking already. So this is called the slash and spread method. It's one of the simplest ways to cut out your balloon or exaggerated sleeve. So now I've gone ahead to cut out on my lining piece, and I iron my estate to my fabric. So for my skirt part, for my lining, I didn't add that 2 inches allowance. I added at the base for my fabric. So this reason I will all share with you all in the second part of this tutorial, which is basically going to be the sewing part. So this is the drafting part, just like I said earlier in the beginning of this tutorial. And in the second part, I'll be sharing with us how to go about the joining of all of these drafted pieces I have right here, from the fixing of the pocket, the joining of our sleeves, the fixing of elastic, and all of that. So trust me, it's never going to be a return of regret. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all in my next one.